In the late 18th century, the British East India Company marched into the Bengal countryside, determined to impose its own brand of order. But what they got wasn't submission. It was something else entirely, a quiet and brilliant revolution. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that story.
Our story kicks off in 1797 at this huge public auction in a place called Burdwan. And what's on the block? The massive estates of the Raja of Burdwan, one of the most powerful local rulers around. The official reason he's losing it all? He couldn't pay his taxes to the British.
You can just picture it, right? Huge crowds are gathered, watching as the Raja's lands, his entire legacy, are sold off piece by piece to the highest bidders. It looks like a classic story, an old power crumbling before a new one. But when the dust settles, the local British collector notices something really strange.
And here's the kicker. Get this. Over 95% of the sales were completely fake. The buyers weren't strangers at all. Nope. They were the Raja's own servants and agents, secretly buying up the land on his behalf. So publicly, it looked like he'd lost everything. But privately, he was still pulling all the strings.
This just leaves us with two massive questions that we're going to dig into. First, why would a guy this powerful go through such an elaborate charade? And second, how in the world did he manage to outsmart the entire East India Company? The answers? Well, they reveal this incredible battle of wits being fought in colonial India. To really get why the Raja did this, we have to rewind a little and look at the system he was fighting against. It was called the Permanent Settlement of 1793. This was the company's big, grand plan to completely reorganize and control rural Bengal. And the guy behind this whole plan? A man named Charles Cornwallis. You might remember him from the American War of Independence. He was fresh off a defeat there, actually. Now, his new job was to make Bengal both profitable and stable for the British. And his solution was a total economic overhaul. The core idea was actually pretty simple. The company decided to fix the amount of tax or revenue that had to be paid from the land forever. They figured this would do two things. One, guarantee them a steady, predictable income, and two, create this new class of rich, loyal landowners who would, in theory, invest in making the land more productive. So under this new system, the old rulers, the Rajas and other local bigwigs called talukdars, were all lumped together and relabeled as zamindars. But let's be clear, this was a serious demotion. The British didn't see them as real landowners anymore. They were basically just glorified tax collectors. Their one and only job was to squeeze the rent out of the villages and hand over a fixed amount to the company.
But almost right away, this grand plan started to backfire. And I mean it backfired spectacularly. Instead of creating a stable class of landlords, the system started to completely crush the very people it was supposed to empower.
And the scale of this crisis was just staggering. In the years right after the permanent settlement was introduced, over 75% of the zamindaris, these huge estates in Bengal, changed hands. This wasn't just a few people messing up. It was the whole system collapsing.
So why was this happening? Well, it really boils down to four main reasons. First, the initial tax the company demanded was just crazy high. Second, it was the 1790s, and crop prices were really low, which meant peasants had no money to pay their rent. Third, the payment rules were brutally strict. And finally, the company had actually taken away the zamindars' power to properly collect that rent in the first place.
And if you want the perfect example of how inflexible this system was, you gotta hear about the sunset law. It was literally what it sounds like. If a zamindar's payment didn't show up by sunset on the day it was due, boom, their estate was automatically put up for auction. No extensions, no excuses. Okay, so while the zamindars are getting hammered by this new system, there's another group, a new power, that's quietly on the rise back in the villages. People started calling them the jotedars, and they were in the perfect spot to take advantage of all this chaos. So who were these guys? The jotedars were basically a class of very wealthy peasants. They owned huge chunks of land, sometimes thousands of acres, that they'd rent out to poorer farmers. But their power wasn't just in land. They also had a grip on local trade and, crucially, they were the local money lenders. And here's a key difference. The zamindars, well, they often lived in these fancy palaces in the cities, totally detached from the countryside they were supposed to be controlling. But the jotedars, they lived right there in the villages, which gave them direct, everyday control over the local peasants. And the jotedars used this position to play the game perfectly. They'd actually encourage the peasants to hold back on paying their rent to the zamindar.
Now, why would they do that? Simple. Because when the zamindar couldn't make his payment to the British and his lands went up for auction, guess who was standing there with cash in hand, ready to buy? You got it, the jotadars.
Which brings us right back to our original mystery. You've got the zamindars, squeezed by a failing system from the top and being sabotaged from the bottom. So how did guys like the Raja of Burdwan manage to survive? Well, they didn't just survive. They fought back with an incredible playbook of resistance tactics. Their strategies were just so creative. We already talked about the fictitious sales, right? But they also used brute force, hiring these tough guys called lathials. They played on the deep loyalty of their peasants, their praja. They even found legal loopholes, like transferring property to female family members, because the company had a rule against seizing property from women. Now, that key legal gray area they used for the fake sales had a name, Benami. It's basically a transaction done using a fake name, specifically to hide who the real buyer is. And let me tell you, the zamindars became absolute masters of the Benami transaction.
So check out how this brilliant scheme worked. It was a cycle of pure bureaucratic warfare. First, the zamindar would deliberately miss his payment. Then, at the auction, his own agents would buy the land, but then they'd refuse to pay the purchase price. So, the government would have to set up another auction, and the agents would buy it again, and again refuse to pay. They'd repeat this over and over, until the government and any real bidders were just exhausted, and they'd finally sell the land back to the zamindar for next to nothing. I mean, it's genius, right?
But it wasn't all just clever paperwork. If some outsider actually managed to buy a piece of the estate, they'd soon find out they couldn't even set foot on the property. The former zamindar's lathials, his muscle, would be there to physically block them, and the local peasants, still loyal to their old master, would refuse to cooperate with any newcomer. And this, really, is the heart of the story. Colonial rule wasn't just a simple case of power being imposed from the top down. The laws made by the British were constantly being challenged, bent, and manipulated by the very people on the ground who were fighting to define power on their own terms.
Now, what's really fascinating is that our main source for all this drama is a massive 1,000-page British document called the Fifth Report. It's an incredible window into what was happening, but of course, you have to read it with a critical eye. It was written to expose how badly the East India Company was managing things, so it definitely has its own biases.
The story of the Raja of Burdwan is such a great reminder that power is never a simple one-way street, and it leaves us with this really big question to think about. When a new system is forced on people, who really ends up in control? The ones who write the rules or the ones who figure out how to master, bend, and sometimes even break them?